Sorry.
Good man. You know what you'll hear at 7, so that's what you're looking out for. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister for Cambridge A, Giles Robertson, to open the case for the government.
Thank you very much. On this side of the House, we believe that civil disobedience is necessary for a peaceful society. We're going to run this as an analysis debate, but as you're all Australians, we guess you're going to be cool with that. And so what we're going to say is if we can show that civil disobedience is necessary to maintain the peaceful society, we say that that's the way we win the debate. What do we mean by this? What are we talking about? Firstly, we're talking about like democracies. We want to set it in terms of democracy. We think there are issues about civil disobedience in other areas, but this is the debate we want to have. We hope it's a debate that we do have. I'd like to talk about civil disobedience. What do we think civil disobedience is? We think civil disobedience, fundamentally, is where people non-violently break bad laws, non-violently break laws peacefully because they disagree with them, because they find them abhorrent. But we reject the idea that civil disobedience is an active revolution against the state. And finally, I'd like to talk about peace. And peace is what I'm going to spend a lot of my time on at the beginning of my speech, because I think there are several ways in which the state can be peaceful. There are several different types of peace that we can have. We think civil disobedience is actually necessary to maintain all of these, and we think that that's the way we're going to do it. So the first thing I'd like to do, thank you, is I'd like to look at the types of peace that we have. We say that the first kind of peace that we have, quite obviously, is a kind of peace as in like not having an external war. We don't think that's the most important thing, because we think civil disobedience typically concerns internal policies. But we think that it is quite important to be aware that people engage in civil disobedience when they disagree with war, and especially where you have countries like the United Kingdom, where I come from, where you don't need parliamentary authorization to go to war. We think civil disobedience is quite an important thing in preventing people from preventing prime ministers from going to war if the country does not wholeheartedly support that. But we also think there are other senses in which peace, and the most important sense of peace in which we're going to deal with today is the idea about peace in terms of legitimacy of the law. We say that a peaceful society, rather than just a peaceful country, is a society that is content with itself, because it is governed by a rule of law. It is governed by a rule of law that is seen as legitimate, and it is governed by a rule of law that is seen as legitimate to the end of having an open society where nobody feels restrained, nobody feels pressured. We think you are at peace when you are free to do what are several things because you do not feel that you are restrained by a capricious state. Go.
What is a bad law?
I'm going to come on to that. At its core, when we're talking about civil disobedience, we kind of reckon that a bad law is what people it's when people think that the law is bad. Obviously, no, listen to me. Obviously, because we're not running a policy, we're not going to say, well, we think people should go out and protest under these certain conditions of laws being bad. But what we think in terms of bad law is that we can look in terms of examples, and we can see examples of people who've seen a bad law. Fundamentally, we think it is when people find that their freedoms have been restricted, that they are most likely to find this a bad law. That is the thing that we think is key. And so you have these several types of peace, and we think peace in terms of legitimacy is most important. And we think that in order to preserve that, and this is the first part of the core of our case, in order to preserve that, we think you need to have civil disobedience. And why do you need to have civil disobedience in order to preserve this piece of legitimacy? Well, that's what I want to go on to, because it's about the relationship between the government and the people. Because we say that in a democracy, it is about peace with itself. The relationship is that the government is essentially the servant of the people. That the consent of the government derives from the people, that the government does what the people want. Now we say, for the first time I'd like to talk about civil disobedience in this context, is the idea about how we deal with consent. Because obviously at the moment we do have institutions like elections that produce consent for laws. We have institutions like elections that produce consent for laws. We simply don't think they're sufficient. What we say is that some of the time the institutions of consent work, and that's okay, but some of the time they don't. And if you're going to have a country that's at peace for itself, if you have these institutions that currently deal with consent and therefore currently try and provide the legitimacy, if there are points where they will fail, and we think that there are those points where they will fail, then you use civil disobedience as the mechanism to restore and maintain that legitimacy. And the example in point here, ladies and gentlemen, is if we've looked at what's happened in Eastern Europe over the past few years in terms of elections. Because you've had seriously rigged elections in Eastern Europe, where governments have tried to prevent the free and fair democratic outcome happening. And what happens? You have people who go down to the main square in the capital, and they sit there, and they refuse to be moved on by the forces of law. Non-violently, but they refuse to be moved on. And that protest leads to negotiations frequently, in at least 4 cases in terms of Georgia, in terms of the Ukraine, in terms of other countries. That has actually led to a change of government, that the people actually wanted. We think that's an example where civil disobedience took a system of establishing consent through elections that wasn't working and managed to fix it, and that's our first example of why civil disobedience is important. Our second example is an idea simply about bad laws. Now the gentleman said, well, how do we find out what laws are bad? And it really is in terms of violating freedom. Let me talk to you, no thank you, about the example that we have in the United Kingdom about restricting public protest. That we have laws that were designed to restrict public protest around Parliament. And people simply said, I find this law unacceptable because it restricts a freedom that I have always had. It restricts a freedom that means it is harder for me to influence the government, and I find that bad. And we support that because we say it was about restricting freedom. And what we saw is that because people broke that law, because people disagreed with it, they went out, they protested, and eventually the law was changed to make the obtaining of licenses for protesting easier, and we think that was good. But finally, I'd like to talk, and I'm going to spend some time on this, no thank you, about the idea of openness. Because I want to go back to what I was saying about peace as legitimacy. Because in order to have this legitimacy, in order to have this society which is peaceful, for an end of being able to be free, for an end of being able to do what you wish within reasonable bounds, but so long as you have that end, we think that the society has to be open. This is the final point. But before I go on to it,
how does this affect the law when people can just object to a law that perceivably restricts their freedom? Doesn't that undermine the integrity of the whole basis of our society?
Well, no, it doesn't, because civil disobedience is fundamentally a mass movement. Like, if one person gets up and says, like, I disagree with that law, that doesn't do very much. We think, like, the only time that civil disobedience works is when lots of people come together and do the same thing. That is an expression of popular sentiment, an expression of popular rejection of what a government that is no longer governing in their interests is doing. We think as long as enough people do it, it is actually legitimate. That is where the legitimacy derives from. So it is acceptable to say that a bad law is what lots and lots of people disagree with. Because it's acceptable if lots and lots of people disagree with laws to vote in a new government. And if that system for voting in a government isn't working, it is also acceptable for them to do it through a mechanism of civil disobedience. But let me go back to this point about openness. We think openness is critical because in order to get this legitimacy, you must have discussion, you must have people talking, you must have an ability to talk. And where do we see this? We see this in the United States, where the American Civil Liberties Union recently published, against a court order, the operations procedure for Guantanamo Bay, and helped produce and continue the debate about what was happening in Guantanamo Bay and what tactics US soldiers were actually using. That was something that was widely supported by the public. We think that it actually moved on the debate and has had an effect on the presidential election by making people talk about it. Again, an example of how to preserve a legitimate society when the US president said, nah, Guantanamo Bay simply isn't applicable to my law. Nobody else has jurisdiction. I can do what I like. That act of civil disobedience by the American Civil Liberties Union, again, helped influence and restore the rule of law and restore the tranquil society. So because it's all about a society that is fundamentally tranquil and under a legitimate rule of law, tempered by the fact that civil disobedience deals with the cases where government oversteps, the electoral mechanisms do not work or are not functioning. That is the case where we feel civil disobedience is acceptable. We feel that otherwise, if we do not have that civil disobedience, we will no longer have the peaceful society, and that is why I beg to propose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes, 25 seconds.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech and warmly welcome the Leader of the Opposition from Sydney A, Chris Croke.
Mr. Speaker, the last time I checked, Britain was the same as Australia in that we, when we vote at the ballot box, don't put down a 1 next to the candidate we like, with an asterisk next to that saying, we're going to support you for the good laws, but when we disagree with you, it's going to be riots on the streets until you give in to us. We say that fundamentally the premise of peaceful democratic societies is that the way in which you allow dissent is through the ballot box, through the public media, through influencing the organic, public, accountable decision-making processes that we consent to as a society. And necessarily, any system where you support, even analytically, the idea that people somehow should wantonly break the law when they feel it's appropriate to break the law is necessarily going to lead to social conflict, social disobedience, social violence, and ultimately the breakdown of the social fabric that we think holds society together. In this speech, I want to make 2 very clear points as to what supporting this sort of system means. The first thing we would suggest is the way in which it legitimizes violence as a political tool and as an outlet of political dissent. And the second thing we want to talk about is how it actually marginalizes legitimate avenues of debate in terms of the public mindset. But before I do, let's talk about what we've heard from the opening government. The problem in their eyes was first that this debate is anchored in, is this idea that there are somehow fundamentally laws which are bad. Well, we would suggest that at no point was it ever explained why electoral institutions are fundamentally unreasonable mechanisms for adjudicating the bad and the good laws and adjudicating change. As a not a particularly passionate Australian about the Howard government, it pleased me greatly when finally the rest of Australia woke up to the criminality of 11 years of a functionally blind 68-year-old. We would suggest that at no point was it justifiable to be marching in the streets and knocking people around, knocking John Howard over as a logical political response, but to vote every 3 years and to make my points heard. Now, all that they could suggest in the way of a law that was objectively bad was that Britain went to war without any sort of public accountability. Well, we would suggest the peaceful protests that took place in the centre of London were a form of public accountability at that particular time, but moreover, we saw the election in 2005 was another level of ex post facto accountability. But not just that, we just don't think it's a good thing that Britons would be encouraged to get in the way of the RAF when they're flying into Basra as a means of trying to stop that war. We think it's ludicrous and it's encouraging and licensing behaviour that is necessarily self-harming. The second thing that we would say is that the solution to this problem of bad laws is necessarily fundamentally inadequate. It's not reasonable for them to get up there and say, no, we'll adjudicate it on a case-by-case basis with a strict majoritarian criterion as to what constitutes a bad law. That sounds, funnily enough, like an election, where if the majority of people decide something is wrong, then they vote a particular way. So,
okay, you have said that you go and put a tick in your ballot box. You put a tick in a ballot box for a person, not an individual law. If an individual law where you agree with the rest of what they say, don't you think that is a case where civil disobedience would be accepted?
Sir, I appreciate your understanding of political theory, but I think you're better off saving it for the Peace Forum tonight. We would suggest that the existence of political parties in, say, first world democracies necessarily means that people are voting for more than whether they think their local member is a good bloke who they'd like to have a beer with. That's why I say, in Australia, for example, the nature of the candidate was in ninth on the exit poll of the issues that people were deciding their vote on. So that idea that people don't consider big social issues in their vote is fundamentally ridiculous in today's debate. This leads me to what I want to talk about in today's debate. The first point I want to make is how a policy of embracing civil disobedience as a healthy political behaviour necessarily legitimises violence. Because we would suggest that their whole idea about peaceful civil disobedience is fundamentally truistic and contradictory. Because peaceful civil disobedience isn't actually civil disobedience, it's legitimate public protest. In first world democracies, we allow the right of people to protest as long as they say, notify the police and that kind of thing. It's about something beyond that. And we would suggest that that something beyond that is almost always the breaking of the law in a fashion that leads to violence. Let's say, for example, when people do that, they lose a conception of the social norms that are governing their behaviours and governing their sense of right and wrong within that society. That's why, say, for example, in Seattle, in the protests against the World Trade Organization, people sure started out like, right, well, I might legitimately, non-violently protest, and then it led to bricks through windows. We would suggest that this relation between civil disobedience and violence is a fundamental axis, and it's necessarily unaccountable and the sort of thing that society should not be encouraging. The second avenue in which it legitimises violence is it simply undermines the legal mechanism by which you regulate violence. Because surely, if on the one hand you're saying that you're banning that people can work against bad laws, but they're still ultimately governed by the criminal law as to what constitutes violence, that seems to suggest that the moral authority of the law is just undermined when you're trying to apply the same laws and you're wrong. You just disagree with the entire system. The second point I want to make in this speech today is to look at how embracing a policy of civil disobedience actually serves to marginalise legitimate avenues of public debate. Because we would suggest that in first world democracies where this debate is clearly taking place, that the public mindset is firmly against actions which lead to violence and actions which take place outside the organised democratic sphere by which we adjudicate public policy. And that necessarily any system which leads to these sort of massive public protests actually leads to these people being marginalised in the eyes of the public, and their cause being further undermined because they embrace a disobedient and ultimately violent form of protest that we think is unaccountable and detrimental to society. So again, we would point you to the example of the WTO in Seattle, where a perfectly legitimate disagreement with the World Trade Organization was just excluded for the next 10 years from any sorts of World Trade organisations because they'd reacted to violence and the public was so intransigent towards that. Mr. Speaker, this opposition has no faith in this government for very good reasons.
Speakers vote for 7 minutes and 18 seconds.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition and call upon Adam Bott, the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do my best to talk as much as possible about peace today. I'm going to talk about 4 types of peace. I'm going to talk about civil order, that's peace in. I'm going to talk about war, that's peace out. I'm going to talk about just and legitimate laws, then I'm going to talk about the open society. That's kind of peace all about, okay? Right, before I do that, I want to go on to some of the things we've heard from the Leader of the Opposition. Because first, he spent a lot of time laughing at the idea of a bad law. At the idea that there is such a thing, that there is what I consider a fairly well-established concept of a law that someone feels in good conscience as a citizen they ought not and cannot obey. We think there is a clear distinction between a law where someone says they would not have set a tax at that level, or a law they would not have preferred to say, no, I refuse to sit at the back of the bus because of the colour of my skin, Mr. Chairman. We think there's a pretty clear distinction between laws that people would prefer were not on the books, and laws that people believe the government has no right to pass, and laws that people believe that they cannot in good conscience hold themselves to. We think that's perfectly clear. We think if you believe in autonomy, you believe that the individual is best placed to try and determine these, and that's a good feedback mechanism for all the reasons Giles gave you at good length in his speech. When democracy is too slow, when democracy is too inefficient, and when democracy occasionally is too undemocratic. So we think the concept of a bad law is perfectly good. Then what do we hear? We heard there is other stuff, there is other means of feedback, so you don't need it. You can vote, right? Which we say is sometimes not good enough, the reasons Giles gave you. We say sometimes it's too slow, sometimes it's too late if this is a bad law. We then heard that it's the media, aside from, of course, the effect of media being under fairly limited control. We say often when, for instance, these are laws about what the media can and can't reveal, when it's something to do with, say, official secrets, we say the only way you can object to this intrusion of your liberty is by breaching these laws, when the media is interested. And we say similarly when it's about peaceful protest. You say, well, you can always express yourself through peaceful protest. What about if, as lots of governments in the West are doing, you restrict the right to peaceful protest, you restrict the places in which you can have a peaceful protest. That very act becomes an act of civil disobedience. So we think that's perfectly straightforward. We think those are mechanisms, but we think those feedback mechanisms are not always sufficient. So we don't think it's good enough to say, express your opinions somewhere else at another time. We don't buy that. And then what we heard, we don't really want to have that debate. We don't really want to accept your definition, because there's no such thing as peaceful civil disobedience because it's necessarily violent. We just don't get that. We think there are lots of examples where you can peacefully refuse to obey a law. You can peacefully refuse to sit at the back of the bus. You can peacefully refuse to pay your poll tax, Mr. Chairman. There are lots of things you can do without taking part in a violent insurgency, so I don't buy that. And then we heard, well, we're inevitably going to marginalise good protesters by being bad protesters. Like, give us some empirical evidence. We think there have been some quite impressive cause célèbre of non-violent civil disobedience when people have thought it was great, when the public got behind it. Sometimes the public didn't. Those people got discredited. Maybe they were wrong about it being a bad law. That's all part of the feedback mechanism proposed by Giles in his speech. All right.
Given all that you require is a mass movement for you to influence the policy of government, don't you take away from the important democratic votes of millions of people?
But what we've explained to you, and this is why I go back to the idea of bad laws and the autonomy of the individual. that people believe there are laws they cannot be expected. Firstly, people believe there are laws they cannot be expected to obey. No matter how many people may have voted for them, they are still legitimate. I'm going to go on to that now with civil society and civil order. No, thank you. And also we have said when there are problems in the democratic mechanism itself, that cannot be enough. Okay? But now I want to look at civil disorder. Because what the opposition wanted us to propose is people going out and being violent on the streets. We think one of the nice things about Western democracies is, generally speaking, people do not violently depose a government when they don't like it. People do not get violent when they oppose a law that they would rather not be on the books. People generally obey laws even if they're not too fond of those laws, even if they think they're bad for their personal interest or for the interest of their country. Why do they do that? Because they believe in the legitimacy of the system and they believe in the legitimacy of the government in question. No, thank you. They believe fundamentally that they have a right to be passing those laws, and they are laws that they have a right to pass, even if our laws they don't disagree with. That is the premise on which civil order rests. That is the premise on which the peaceful society rests. Right? If a government isn't prevented from passing laws which transgress those bounds, transgress the bounds that reasonable people feel they can expect to be obeyed. If they aren't prevented by the disincentive that they will know there'll be mass non-participation. If they aren't prevented by the reality of people failing to follow those laws, then you move away from the moderation which guarantees the civilly peaceful society. So that's where you win on that basis. There's peace in. Secondly, we say peace out. Okay? And we want to talk about illegitimate wars, because we think that is a prime example of the citizen being asked to do something which sometimes they cannot in good conscience do. To fight somewhere, no thank you, where they believe the war is unjust, where the war sometimes is unjust, and they cannot be expected to do it. It's no good to them, no thank you, to say, wait for the next time you can go and vote, and then vote against this war and hope other people do too. It's no thank you. So we say that when people refuse to sign up to a war, when people refuse to be drafted into a war they believe to be unjust, we think that's fair. We think it's a good check and balance that the people who are expected to be fighting the war, the people who are expected to be risking their lives for the war, have the ability to opt out of it. So we think it's a good check and balance there. There's peace out. Okay, thirdly I want to talk about just and legitimate laws. Because we've explained, no thank you, that we need it as a feedback mechanism. That democracy, no thank you, can be limited. That it functions at the moment. That governments are aware of issues of passing taxes where there is non-compliance, of passing laws where you get jury nullification, of passing things where you provoke protest outside legitimate protest zones, of passing laws. They are wary of passing laws where they know that people who are not seen as normally outside the law, who have not considered themselves criminals and lawbreakers, will not obey it. That is an essential part of the feedback mechanism. That's an essential part of democracy's mechanism. Fourthly, we say it's an integral part of an open society. Because democratic feedback mechanisms don't always work. Because governments in democracies don't always tell you. In order to give people the full story, sometimes you have to break the law in the first place. We'd give you the example of Mordecai Vanunu in Israel, when he said, I will break the law in order to let people know about the country's nuclear program. When you say, because the country is doing something illegitimate, the people have to know. There are issues of and the issue Giles mentioned of newspapers in the United States reading details of what was going on in Guantanamo, of saying the country or the state is doing something illegitimate, or individuals or businesses are doing something illegitimate, and to maintain the open society, which is a necessary predicate for a peaceful society, we need that too. So if you believe that the open society where people have free information and discourse is necessary for a meaningful peace, because you believe that peace is not just about submission, but about the freedom and security to go on in a free discourse, knowing you can say what you like and knowing you have full information to elect your government. If you believe that peace is a society operating in just laws, if you believe that peace is also a society not engaging in bad wars, if you believe that peace is a society without civil disorder, then you need the check and balance provided by civil disobedience. You need people's right to stand up and be counted and refuse to obey a bad law. I beg to move.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who is Steve Hind.
Mr. Speaker, the vibe I got from the opening government was that when they said we know things are bad laws, or we have a right to break bad laws, they were really talking about the soft left intelligentsia. Because the problem with their stance in this debate is this. Well, they want to defend the right of media outlets to publish classified documents because they feel they have enough mass support behind them. they then must, by the same token, defend the rights of people who believe in domestic violence or who believe in religious persecution to break the laws against those things too. Because they can mobilise a violent mass movement, they can mobilise a lot of people who agree with them, but they don't fit with the opening government's nice conception of what a bad law is. And that's why we leave it to the majority, Mr. Speaker. That's why we leave it to electorally elected governments to make those decisions. That's why we don't say, if you feel strongly enough and can get enough names on a petition to come and do a sit down in the middle of a major road, we will change the law for you, Mr. Speaker. I want to look at three things in my speech. I'm going to look firstly at consent mechanisms. I'm going to look secondly at the legitimacy of governments and just laws. And thirdly, I'm going to look at the effect of this proposal on the others, or as I like to call them, the majority, who don't break the law and who voted for the laws that the opening government disagreed with in the first place. So in terms of consent mechanisms, the first thing you heard here was that elections are not enough. That's why Chris pointed out very, very well that elections aren't the only consent mechanism that exists. Indeed, there's peaceful protest, there's opinion polling, there's writing to your local member, there's making your voice heard in a way that doesn't involve just breaking a law because you've decided to take your bat and ball and go home because the government that you voted for turns out to not fit with your exact political views. No, thank you. And look, we'll agree with our opposition that in theory an Athenian model of plebiscites probably is the best way to make sure, to decide whether or not each law has majority support. The reason that we moved away from that since the time of ancient Greece is that societies are somewhat bigger and the countries that governments have to govern are somewhat larger than single cities. That's why we put our trust in entire elected bodies, and that's why those entire elected bodies are the ones that we have to stick with. But then you heard the nice truistic tautologic element of the opposition's case, which was that laws that are broken here are necessarily bad laws, and we know something's a bad law because it's necessarily a mass movement against it. We'd say that the existence of a mass movement doesn't actually show that you have mass or majority support. What it shows is you are very good at mobilising people who agree with you. Who by and large are good at mobilising people who agree with them? The young, the idle, the extremists, and the very passionate. We don't want, just because people who've got the time to go and commit mass protests, or the political fervour to commit mass protests go and do it, isn't a reason why their political views carry more weight in the political system. Someone who makes their vote on one issue or with a particular sense of apathy, in a democratic tradition, has their vote carry the same amount of weight when it comes to the end of the democratic road. And that's why we don't think people get to go, hey, but I really object to this law, therefore I won't follow it, because that is not the way in which you promote legitimate government and the rule of law. Yes?
So when majority rules at the election box fails to accommodate for the needs of minority groups, what kind of recourses do minority groups have?
By voting and convincing other members of the majority that their cause is a just one and their cause is a means worth protecting. Julio, pointing to the civil rights movement in the United States, the black minority weren't getting anywhere by just breaking the laws themselves. They were getting oppressed when they just broke the laws themselves. They moved forward in the civil rights movement when they convinced, using legitimate channels, the rest of America that they had a case and that they deserved rights. No, thank you. That was a great point. So, let me talk about the legitimacy of governments and the legitimacy of laws, because we don't think this mechanism for deciding just laws, i.e. you feel strongly about it, is particularly strong enough. Because when our opposition wanted to talk about a feedback loop and wanted to bring this debate down to like two examples, which is conscientious objectors to war and the media releasing classified documents, what they didn't realise is that democracy covers for both of those things. The reason the draft got abolished in America and it got abolished in Australia is because it was grossly unpopular and governments that proposed it were voted out at the ballot box. And the reason, in this situation when you talk about media freedom, most countries that have laws to do with classified documents or sedition have a defence that can be raised by the media organisations in question, which is a defence of necessity to the public interest to know versus necessity to the public interest to keep it repressed. And we let our judicial system make that weighing up. We don't let the people who think they know better than everyone else to do that weighing up. Because let me bring you back to the principle I started my debate with. If you say that the average man on the street or the average group of people on the street knows better than everyone else, then you can't just accept that on your terms. You can't just accept it when it's a media organisation that wants to release extra documents. You've got to also accept it when it's a large group of people who don't follow the same laws about religious tolerance or religious persecution, Mr. Speaker, because that is all the same type of mass movement against perceived bad laws. Either that or we have some kind of dictatorship of the soft left in this debate. Let me then talk about the rest in this debate. And here's what I want to add substantively, because what I think's been ignored so far is that when people vote for something in an election, and that's put into place only for the people who didn't get their way to take their bat and ball and go home, it does some pretty damaging things to the people who were part of the majority and to the people who voted for the initial laws and the initial powers. We think, firstly, it says to people, unless you're willing to break laws, you're never going to have your way in the democratic system. It says elections are really secondary to your ability to organise mass protests and mass disobedience. Now, you wouldn't take any from us. Don't get too smart with it, mate. It says that unless you're willing to go extreme and go undemocratic to get democracy, you're not going to get your way. More importantly, it says to people that radical action is the only way forward on minority issues. It says that because the government, no thanks Julia, will bend to you whenever you make a big enough stink, then the way in which to effect change isn't to actually go through democratic channels, isn't to show the government the legitimacy and the rule of law the respect that it deserves, but is instead just to break laws willy-nilly. Because we think that people who break laws and think that laws are unjust always think they're right. People who use recreational drugs because they think the government has no right to tell them not to, do so because they think it's an unjust law. Unfortunately for them, two things happen. Firstly, they don't really necessarily know what they're talking about a lot of the time, and that's another debate entirely. But secondly, the majority simply don't agree with them. We don't think in this debate you have the right, because you think you know better than everyone else, to take your bat and ball and go home. In this debate, we either had to throw weight behind democracy, which both sides were willing to do, or we had to say that somehow a small group of people knew better and they should be making all the decisions, since when they just disagreed enough, something automatically became an unjust law, Mr. Speaker. So that's why we stand firmly behind democracies. That's why we stand firmly behind elections, the media, and the right of people to pursue legitimate channels of protest, but not beside their right to take their bat, ball, and go home and say that they're no longer part of a government because they disagree with a certain law.
You can spoke for 7 minutes and 14 seconds.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome the third speaker for the government from Sydney B, Julia Bowes.
Here.
Mr. Speaker, what we have today is a debate in essence that's looking at the question of how can democracy best operate. What we have on this side of the House is an acknowledgement that democracy, as Winston Churchill once said to paraphrase, is the best or worst form of government that we have. And recognising that democracy is often inadequate, that democracy is often insufficient, what we're looking to do here in the close of government today is to bridge that gap where it exists. And there is no direct means of influences for groups who are politically disenfranchised. Because what we recognise on closing government in this debate is that there are two principles of democracy. Firstly, the principle is that majority rules, something that this side of the House has wanted to stand for. But what we recognise is that when majority rules, that often perpetuates inequality, and that the theoretical basis of democracy, in which each vote counts individually, simply isn't borne out empirically and in reality. And when that is incongruent with the second principle of democracy, which is everyone's right to have their rights recognised, to have reform be a potential of the law, and have dissent be a healthy and functioning part of democracy, then in those situations we support, we support civil disobedience, and we think that's for two clear reasons, and that's going to be our extension today. The first prong of our extension is going to look at, because of the insufficiencies and inadequacies of democracy, why that necessitates a more direct means of involvement and engagement with government and forms of protest for minority groups. And the second bit is going to look at the more hairy area where public interest and individual interest conflict. Why on this side of the House we think that individual interest in the form of civil disobedience still should prevail in light and in conflict with majority public interest. But let's deal quickly with two issues that arose in the first half. Let's deal quickly with the most spurious argument that I've heard debating in a very long time, which is that because you see a bunch of feral lefties on the street, you're going to go home and think it's okay to hit your wife. Mr. Speaker, we currently have protests all over Western countries, and sometimes they do turn violent. Nobody ever, before Steve stood up in this debate, has suggested that that's a causal link between a husband hitting his wife. What we say is that in their very nature, the vast majority of civil disobedience cases are perpetuated by the kind of pinkos that Steve takes aversion to. And these people are generally pacifist, and they're trying to break the law law in a way that serves a direct political purpose. That's why it's not rampant violence, because the definition of civil disobedience, Mr. Speaker, is to serve that political purpose. But even when it does turn to violence, as some extremist groups did in the American Civil Rights Movement, we say that's because the law is there as a measure to oppress them. And unless attention is brought to that area, they're only going to continue to be punished by the law that is meant to protect them. But on the second and more difficult issue of the majority, and what this does to the majority consent for government and majority vote, in terms of the supposed idea that would radicalise them, we say that kind of is a simplification of the issues. So the exact problem, and this is where our abstention feeds into this debate, is that issues in elections are multifaceted, and people who live in democracies and who live in the majority and live in the centre tend to vote on issues that concern them and aren't actually offended by minority movements that when they pop up around the globe. So they're not offended by this running contrary to their aims. It simply wasn't an issue that they voted on. But it's certainly not something, and I'll take you in a minute, Tim. It's not something that they think is repugnant to democratic system and encourages them to radicalise, because by and large they sit in the centre and 90% of laws appease their interests. So it's not like they're being put out by these protesters. Yes?
A substantial amount of civil disobedience comes from people who don't believe the government has the right to legislate in private sphere areas like their wives or their children or whatever. Your policy perpetrates this belief that you can make laws about your family, the government can't.
No, okay. What this law is about individual autonomy, right? Civil disobedience people go out there with a specific political purpose, right? You don't see a mass group of angry, drunk, white men on the street saying, I have the right to hit my wife. Those aren't the sort of protests that we're talking about. But even if they are, this doesn't mean that the law necessarily changes, because there's a clear harm to the individual lives of being hit in that case. But when you're talking about people standing up for their own rights, like Africans Americans saying they have the right to drink from a bubbler, something that doesn't affect a third party, that's when the law will change, because it doesn't harm anyone. Yeah. Just the fact that you protest, Mr. Speaker, doesn't mean the law's going to change. This is about your right to question whether it should. And in a large amount of instances, those people, as history is borne out, do have the right to say that, and the law does change accordingly. So why is the ballot box, which the opening opposition in this debate wanted to stand by, insufficient? Why isn't it able to accommodate minority views? Well, firstly, it's just described by the term, minority. But those kind of issues just aren't going to hold the clout in elections with mass populations, as Steve gave you in his description of the development of democracy since the time of ancient Greece. That means they're going to get sufficient attention or even affect the lives of the majority of people that vote. But secondly, the agenda in elections, as anyone who's lived in a Western democracy would know, and I'll take you in a minute, Steve, is set by politicians and it's set by the media, and to be a successful politician, you need to be handed to the most amount of people rather than making the smallest amount of impact for a minority of people. Steve.
Both of the examples your bench has talked about, the draft and the civil rights movement, were corrected by the electoral mechanism when governments who proposed those laws were elected. Why then is civil disobedience the cause?
Okay, because Steve, here's a history lesson for you. They didn't just in America suddenly sit on a bus and think, hey, it's really crap that the blacks are sitting in another area. It took people like Rosa Parks, it took decades of civil disobedience, organised civil disobedience, to bring that issue to the fore. And that's when the legislative event took place. But what we're looking at here is the reason why these people are not equal to begin with and why democracy fails them. It's because they don't generally have the resources or the literacy or the education or the networks to sustain a political movement in the same way that a large federal party does that sits somewhere near the centre. And therefore they need a more direct means. That's the kind of thing that limited African Americans and meant that sitting at the back of the bus like Rosa Parks did was the only means they could take to have direct access to their government and to criticise those policies. And that was the trigger, Steve, for the civil rights movement. And that's the kind of thing that happened again in England and Australia 70 or 80 years ago when union movements were weak and workers were disenfranchised, and this was a means used to give the disenfranchised more access to a government that purported to represent them. But finally, when it does intersect with public interest, why do they still have the right? Something we're willing to defend here at the closing government. It's because it has a disproportionate effect on their life. So when things like when you break a sedition law, or when you're a truck driver in America that refuses to have a drug test, whilst the majority will sit by and say that doesn't affect my individual liberty, the fact that it affects your individual liberty in a minority of case means that you have the right to protest against that kind of majoritarianism prevailing over your interests and your rights. And so for those reasons, because democracy is not equal, We think that people need a more direct means of control, and for that reason, we're very proud to support civil disobedience.
7:36.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome the third speaker for the opposition from Monash B, Tim Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the government are a little bit confused about actually what civil disobedience is. It's not necessarily a physical protest, ladies and gentlemen. It's predominantly doing things like breaking the law. And when you set the debate into democracies, the majority of the time, protests are legal. It's things like breaking certain laws you just don't agree with, and that's not just protesting, ladies and gentlemen, or sitting at the back of the bus. That's doing things that we think, on our side of the house, harms other individuals around you, but moreover hurts society. What we're going to give you at closing opposition is the role of government, particularly the state, ladies and gentlemen, and the private sphere. People who believe that governments don't have a right to legislate on their individual family issues or on their religious family issues. What this government policy does, ladies and gentlemen, in effect to those people. But before I do, I've got 2 points I want to talk about. Firstly, what the opening gave us about the concept, ladies and gentlemen, that people need an outlet. And secondly, the extension of the closing government about a failure of democracy. What we heard on this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can do these things in peaceful ways in order to have an outlet in a specific way. No, thank you. And what we said on our side of the house quite clearly, ladies and gentlemen, was this often inherently provides not just physical violence, because the opening of this didn't just talk about physical violence, talk about social violence, ladies and gentlemen, and things like social chasms between different groups. That's just not physical violence, ladies and gentlemen, that's about the way you affect other people. And we think on our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, civil disobedience doesn't just talk about and act about violence, ladies and gentlemen, but it's about the way in which you deal with the state. But moreover, what we heard from this side of the house is that majoritarianism, in effect, is failing. What we heard from Bobo, ladies and gentlemen, was that people vote on central issues. That people don't vote on issues people vote on issues that affect themselves, and that's not necessarily minority. We think a couple of issues on this point. Firstly, we think in a lot of democracies, you do have policy platforms of lots of different parties, ladies and gentlemen, on lots of different laws. In fact, in Australia, you have someone who represents the concept of having no gambling in certain places, ladies and gentlemen. He's elected. We'd say those sorts of platforms are viable in lots of electorates. So that's just not the case, ladies and gentlemen. And even if it was, even if we accept the concept that majoritarianism isn't the best way, ladies and gentlemen, the policy of the government makes it much worse. The policy of the government says that people have the ability to opt out of a democracy, have an ability to opt out of the sovereignty of state over their rights and their abilities to do certain things and make laws with their own consent. No thank you. Second, we heard this failure of democracy, and what we heard at closing opposition was, well, there's no direct means of engagement, that politicians set their own forms of agenda, ladies and gentlemen, and that minorities don't have any resources. What we'd say firstly, ladies and gentlemen, is you encourage minorities to exist outside the mainstream. No, thank you. You encourage them to break laws, ladies and gentlemen, and sit outside what the current system is. What that does in particular, and what it tells you, the majority that we think is important that you should try and change their minds, ladies and gentlemen, instead of protesting, is you tell them that we're no longer interested in engaging in a democratic concept. We're no longer interested in engaging in the laws in which we've set. But then what we had was what happens when the public interest crushes with the private interest about things like people who take drug tests, and public don't really care about that. We'd say firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that we think you have a right to protest and a right to bring those people to court. Our issue, ladies and gentlemen, is the way in which you have that civil disobedience, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's worse when you do those sorts of things. This moves me to my extension, but before I do, yes, Ms. Bowes.
Okay, Tim, we don't support anarchy, i.e. randomly breaking laws. We support breaking laws to serve a specific political purpose. When that is a law that violates your individual freedom, why don't you have the right to directly oppose it?
The problem with the question is that you may not have listened to your Prime Minister's whole speech. When I asked him a point of information on what a bad law was, his answer was, it's a bad law. It doesn't have to be a political law. That's not what your opening government said, ladies and gentlemen. It's just a bad law. That's the problem with your case. What we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, in this debate is there's an open and half focus on public issues, ladies and gentlemen, on public and predominantly political issues. And we heard Steve talk about the hard left, on the soft left, sorry. We want to talk about the hard right in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. People, according to what the Deputy Prime Minister said, who don't believe the government has an ability or a legitimacy to make laws about your internal interests. I mean, they're the people who are predominantly on the religious right, the people who believe in things like polygamy, ladies and gentlemen, that kind of civil disobedience, the belief that you can break the law on the basis that the government doesn't have a right to legislate on religious and personal issues. We're talking about, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, why you have a government that intervenes in those instances and why civil disobedience is counterproductive, but secondly, how this hurts the concept of the state deterring people, continuing actions that hurt other people. So I want to move on firstly about protecting vulnerable people. And we think the government intervenes on issues, particularly domestic and family issues, to protect vulnerable people, ladies and gentlemen. Protect people who don't have an ability to protect themselves. That's why we have laws on polygamy. That's why in lots of countries, and increasingly we have laws against domestic violence and also smacking children. We think those laws are particularly important in modern society, I'll take you in a second, sir, particularly important in a modern society in protecting predominantly societies that are patriarchal, religious right people who are Mormons or who live in cults that run on those sorts of instances. But yeah.
Okay, sir. Your side have already conceded, as truistic, are examples of things such as civil rights, which are fundamental to keeping democratic societies actually democratic. Is the biggest harm you can show us of this phenomenon some people having too many wives?
I think it's a pretty big harm, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a big harm that you think you're able to smack the hell out of your kid. The government doesn't have a right to intervene because they think you don't have a right to make laws on what I can do to my own kids. I think that's a pretty big harm, ladies and gentlemen. And this moves on to what the problem in this debate fundamentally is. That these people don't think that secular governments have a right to intervene in their private lives. The message you send, ladies and gentlemen, the message you send when you can disobey civilly these sorts of laws and have multiple wives is that you're allowed to do what you want as long as you have a posse, ladies and gentlemen. As long as you have enough people that'll back you up. And quite frankly, Mormons do have quite a big posse. Ask Mitt Romney. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that in breaking those sorts of laws, you don't have the ability to consent in that instance. That moves me on to my second point about deterrence. We've ignored on the government case why you actually have laws, ladies and gentlemen. You have them to try and protect people. You have them for trying to protect people against themselves and the government. And we don't think this policy does that. We think when you have laws that are effectively enforced wholeheartedly, when you don't allow groups like Mormons to break the law because they don't believe it's a good law, sets an example to other people in society, particularly far right and far left groups, that they don't have to follow a law if they don't think the government has a right to intervene in a personal sphere. We think that those people are hurt, that vulnerable people are hurt by a model that says that if you can get a posse, you're allowed to break the law. We proudly beg to oppose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome Naomi to close the case for Sydney and the government.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, at closing government, me and my posse, these boys, proposed an analysis of what democracy means and how democracy functions in principle compared to practice. And the crux of that extension was telling you that you need mechanisms such as civil disobedience as a lever for people who are politically disenfranchised because of lack of literacy, lack of resources, lack of being part of a political party with a big machine to deliver results when there is a case of a law that punishes them for reasons beyond their control and they feel discriminated against.
sense. That's what we told you was the most important conception of democracy, balancing rights of individual against the rights of the state. And that bench would happily forego the rights of all minority groups until every 4 years an election rolls around, because majority wins. Ladies and gentlemen, not only under their model do the minority lose out, but we think in the long term the majority lose out too. So I'm going to look at 3 questions in my speech today. Firstly, the closing opposition extension. Does this model legitimise perceptions that you can just self-legislate and set your own laws? No, thank you. Second of all, can we rely on elections and electoral institutions alone, or is this actually a necessary thing in a democratic society? And thirdly, what happens to agenda setting? But first, let's go back to the extension. The perceptions that you can just make laws for yourself. No, thank you. And the crux of this was talking about when the government intervenes to protect the vulnerable, that we should respect government laws because they're there to keep people in their best interests and preserve their welfare. So things like polygamy and things like domestic violence. But the kinds of examples we've been talking about in this debate are ones which are politically motivated and usually in mass groups. Laws that target, for example, Islamic communities, laws that impose tougher sentences on particular ethnicities who commit particular types of crimes, like mandatory detention, or things that criminalise homosexuality, the kinds of laws that punish people rather than protect people. And your model doesn't allow those people to have any recourse in the immediacy because they have to wait for the election to roll around. And as Bobo told you, there's a very big difference between supporting civil disobedience and supporting anarchy. We don't think this model in by any way gives people a right to hit people in their home. No, thank you. See, but the last point on this also is that what we heard from Tim was that you encourage people to disengage from the democratic process. These are people not interested in the democratic process. And as we explained in our extension, the people most concerned about in this debate are ones who would like to participate in the democratic process but lack the kind of equipment to do so. Those are the people who lose out under the status quo and would lose out under your model in a much more severe circumstance. Fiona.
I don't really agree, but civil disobedience is inherently subjective. You've acknowledged that on your bench. So how does that mean that only favourable minorities
if it's subjective, that's fine. But the difference under our model is you allow that to get some media coverage and you put it to the people when politicians and the discretion of media tycoons don't put it to the people. So we think in terms of it being subjective, the people that should be making those decisions are the broader population, and you deny them the right to access the kinds of information about what's aggrieving minority groups, ladies and gentlemen, when you take away that oxygen. The second question in this debate, can we just rely on elections and electoral institutions alone? And all through the bench we've heard that majorities being voted in, they should have their views represented. And we told you that was dangerous a lot of the time if the minority rights don't come up on the agenda and the majority gets a mandate for the suppression of those minority groups. No thank you, because we said that the majority has capacities, the minorities don't. And all you can sign them to do under the op model is sit around idle until the next election. So then Steve searched for more and he said, but you can do more than that. You can write letters to your local member. There's other avenues for change. Well, why is that still not enough in contrast to mass mobilisation movements that garner media publicity? And that's again because you presuppose that these people have the capacity to target people in that way, to mobilise enough letter writing people such that members actually change their minds. We think those letters go at best in the filing cabinet and forgotten about, but more often than not in the bin where nothing changes. But the last point again is that they're simply not media generating. We think that's the crux of democratic reform, a free and open society in which you have the capacity to spread information. And before I do my last point, I'll take you, Chris.
Naomi, if the problem is one of political oxygen, why does encouraging minorities to break the law capriciously necessarily help their interests when the public is so opposed to them? Like
we say because a lot of the time the public doesn't realise that these laws viciously and perniciously punish certain groups. We'd say that until the harmful effects of a lot of those laws are actually made public, the broader public simply doesn't know about it. So in terms of the majority just assumes that everything's okay, that maybe 3 strikes and you're in jail isn't that bad, we'd say it's only when those types of groups have the capacity to rebel against it that people know that perhaps laws criminalising homosexuality are much worse than the broader public thinks about. And this leads nicely into the third question of this debate, which is how do we enhance agenda setting in a way that is integral to democracy? And here Steve asked a point of information to Julia, and he said the kinds of problems you guys are talking about were fixed by governments eventually. Things like the draft. We'd say, how did they know that it should be on the agenda in the first place? How did broader public support develop in against those movements. We'd say it's from the mass mobilisation of civil disobedience movements that led to that kind of media coverage, the kinds of agendas that counteract that of politicians. And when you create an event that simply cannot be ignored by the broader populace. And here, no thank you. The response we got was, yeah, you should still use the election processes because you can have a single party platform, ladies and gentlemen, that you can just go on one issue and get elected. First of all, we think those people very rarely have the capacity to legislate. At best, they might get one vote in their whole term that swings the balance of power. And second of all, we just don't think that they get a lot of media coverage. The fact that Tim couldn't even name Steve Xenophon, the gambling guy, as he talks about, just shows you the fact that they're marginalised and trivialised in those processes and don't get a lot of coverage, because I'm clever. Ladies and gentlemen, what we told you on this side of the house was that you need to balance public interest with individual interests. More often than not, those individual interests, in case of minority groups, when the majority wins all the time, happen to be oppressed and suppressed. We're not happy to make those people, to consign those people to unfair and unjust laws waiting around for the next election. We told you on this side of the house that when imbalances and inequalities between capacities to use the electoral process fails, the best mechanism for those people, and moreover for society as a whole, was in order to allow them civil disobedience as a leverage. We were very proud to propose.
You can spoke for 7 minutes and 7 seconds.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome Fiona Prowse to close for Monash B in the opposition.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as was very clear in this debate and often forgotten when claiming all the benefits that the government bench has, this debate takes place within democracies, ladies and gentlemen. And when Bobo acknowledged, when Tim asked her a point of information about polygamy and unfavourable private sphere behaviour, when she said, not all laws will change, ladies and gentlemen. This won't always result in an overthrow of laws based upon people's opinions. She's exactly right. So if we take her on her analysis, ladies and gentlemen, that often nothing actually changes, then what is the point of what we have heard from the government bench? Because this is what the government bench has proposed. Step 1, find some friends, ladies and gentlemen, preferably a few because you'll get more media attention. Step 2, break the law in some way because you don't agree with it because it's a bad law, in the words of the Prime Minister. Step 3, let's hope it gets on the media. We'd say that's not the way for minorities, that's not the way for societies to function in the production of laws. Because what Tim said is, it actually pushes minorities away. It encourages the perception that they just break laws, ladies and gentlemen. Who cares about them? And as Bobo acknowledged, often doesn't actually result in any genuine outcome for these minorities. Let's ask 3 questions at the end of today's debate about whether this actually changes and gives people an opinion where they don't have one at the moment. I firstly want to look at the concept of democratic institutions and do we actually care about the integrity of democracy? I'm going to tell you that we should. Secondly, I'm going to look at this idea in terms of minorities and if this is the saving grace, if they just need to, effectively pick up arms and, get media airtime to fix all their problems. And very finally, I'm going to look at the concept of the integrity of law. The discussion that Tim had about deterrence, which we never heard a response from. Because strangely enough, we have laws for a reason, ladies and gentlemen, to protect individuals from harmful situations. And unless you're going to overthrow the whole idea of democracy and that the majority of individuals should be able to make laws about what harms them, and we think polygamy is a social harm, then nothing happens, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at democratic institutions, because the requirement that was set up in today's debate is that you need to have non-violent mass movements. We don't think that's too hard to mobilise in the current climate. That's never been denied. And when I asked in a point of information to the Deputy Prime Minister, don't you think this literally undermines millions of voters, ladies and gentlemen, who have voted to ensure that there are certain laws, like consent laws, ladies and gentlemen, like things like not having lots of wives? We'd say that undermines their votes. And he didn't actually respond to that in any kind of substantial way. He kind of fluffed around. And that's because it does undermine millions of people's votes. It says that what they decide at the polls doesn't matter because at the end of the day, individuals, if they perceive it to be bad, if it violates their liberty, like nearly every single law is intended to prevent, ladies and gentlemen, they can object to it. Because what we think is that people can firstly vote. And we don't agree with this idea that voting is ineffective, ladies and gentlemen. We certainly haven't heard anything better from the government aside from regular things in this scenario. We also think that the majority shouldn't be manipulated by the minority of people's opinions in this scenario. We think that if a majority view is held, upheld, then that's when you do get changes in governments, ladies and gentlemen. That's when you do get a change in votes if it's really that drastic a situation. Because we don't have anything based upon what the government said to ensure that only favourable minorities like homosexuals or African Americans are going to break these laws. And that's what our effectively extension was about. Because what they assumed throughout today's debate is that only the people who disagree with the bad laws from our perspective are going to break them. And we told you that it's going to be a hell of a lot more people than that. And the majority of people that don't believe that the law has a place in their private life aren't subjectively favourable. Don't you agree?
Okay, if you're in the Ukraine in 2005, and the only way that you can get the majority rule you so want is through civil disobedience, would you do that?
Well, we don't think that that's the only way that people can garner support in countries in this scenario, aside from the fact that that wasn't the type of democratic picture that you're painting in today's debate. But we think that the way you get favourable change, ladies and gentlemen, is through changing people's minds, not through violence that you're supporting on that side of the house, albeit a bit inconsistently. Let's look at the second idea in regards to minorities. They had two parts to extension. Firstly, minorities have no direct means of involvement in society because no one cares about their plight because there aren't many of them. What we think is firstly that this just isn't true. We do see increasingly in democracies representation of different opinions. When we see things like coalitions, we have to encompass lots of different people in this type of a scenario, ladies and gentlemen, in order to rule. We think that those types of opinions are supported. We don't think this debate takes place in a society where African Americans aren't allowed to drink from a water tap, ladies and gentlemen. Society has drastically changed from that point forward. We haven't heard a discussion otherwise. We also think that it gives minorities a very bad image when they have to take to violent means, no thanks guys, when they have to take to violent means to express their opinions, when they have to break the law in order to change something. That's what gets them bad media time, because that's not what changes people's opinions on the ground the majority of the time. They resent that they abide by laws and other people don't. We don't think that's the right image we want to be giving them in today's debate. The second element was that sometimes public and individual interests conflict, and if a truckie wants to be able to, reject a drug test, then he should be able to. We don't think he should, ladies and gentlemen, because that drug test is there for a point. It's so he doesn't get coked up and kill people on the road, ladies and gentlemen. And those are the types of law that we think should remain, because we forget in today's debate that laws are there for a reason. It's there to provide deterrence to very harmful things, like coked up truck drivers, I imagine, are pretty harmful. But it's also there, ladies and gentlemen, so the society is making a judgment call, like that it is a public harm when you have lots of wives, that you should need a consent law in scenarios. Yes, Julie.
Thank you. Yeah, you can subjective this, subjective that on your point of information, but right here, just because you disagree with that law, what if a law criminalises your race, your ethnicity, your sexuality? Why don't you have the right to oppose it?
Okay, well firstly, we don't know what democratic society you're talking about, where all these races are criminalised, ladies and gentlemen. But even if that's the case, we're perfectly proud to, on the opposition bench, to support democracy going forward, to support the concept that this is the best scenario we can have in genuine societies in this mechanism, that we represent the majority of voters, and often we have things like proportional representation where other people get involved in democratic processes. So unless you're overthrowing that, nothing changes for minorities, you give them a worse image. And that leads me to the final point to do with the integrity of law, because I've told you how it effectively allows people a free-for-all in whatever laws they deem they want to break. A point that was never acknowledged by the opposition, because all they said is that's just not what we're talking about in today's debate. It's called a new example, guys, and that's what our extension was about. A new problem that your type of a policy creates when other people take what you're saying. Even if they don't have a mass movement, we think this sends a message to citizens that if they don't agree with the law, then they're perfectly entitled to break it if it violates their individual liberty, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's a very dangerous precedent for our law to be setting in this type of a context. We think it's especially dangerous when we look at the harmful crimes that Tim did in our extension, because they don't actually deliver the benefits for minorities that they claim, and because we are content with the majority and with the integrity of laws, we're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank all the speakers. Please cross the floor and leave us to it. We'll make a decision as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was at least an hour and 3 minutes, not just an hour.
Yeah.
Nice.